Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Shadrach and Benny as VeggieTales calls it. So we have Nebuchadnezzar. He built a 90-foot tall golden statue for people to worship him. Every time the flute, lyre, harp, all these things made noise, everyone bowed down to worship him. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they obviously weren't having it. They were friends of Daniel. This is in the book of Daniel, chapter 3. I'm going to start reading just here real quick. 3:16 says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king. He was asking them to bow down. They had brought them up and said, why didn't you bow down to me? Why aren't you worshiping? So Nebuchadnezzar was giving them an ultimatum here. And he said, who's going to rescue you from my power? Nebuchadnezzar's saying, he said, who's going to rescue you from my power if you don't bow down? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to the question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden statue you have set up. So they're saying no matter what, whether we get saved or not, we are not worshiping you. We're following God, the one true God. And no matter what, whether we live or die through this, God is still on the throne, no matter what. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He had favor with them before, but it's earlier in Daniel. He gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than was customary. I don't know what a furnace is normally, but if you have a raging fire in the first place for people that you normally throw people into the furnace, and he says, I want it 7 times hotter. And he comes and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. They were fully clothed, tied up, and thrown into the furnace. Now this is where the Bible, it just seems to like to go back and forth here. To give a little more context, it says, since the king's commandment was so urgent and the furnace extremely hot, 7 times, the raging flames killed the men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire. So when the super strong men that tied Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel 3, 3:19 to 23, if they died because the flames were so hot, how did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fall into the fire? That's my question. That's the questions you ask. As I've been saying in this series, they weren't thrown into the fire, they fell into the fire. No one threw them. They weren't picked up and thrown into the fire. Even if the guards were carrying them, the guards died from the heat, and then they fell in. The guards didn't fall in, it says, that the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. And of course we know, and they say, they see a man, like the Son of God in the fire, which is a question of where Daniel was during this process. Like the Son of God. It doesn't mean that it was Jesus, he said, like. And the other question is, how did Nebuchadnezzar know what the Son of God looked like? When he said, I see one like in the sun, he said he sees someone that looks like Jesus in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and their clothes weren't burning and they weren't hurt. In fact, I believe that their hands were freed and the ropes burnt away, but they didn't, or their clothes. If that's the case, then this is 2 parts then, meant for just to be one, but we'll go with it, is that how were they, or did they jump into the fire? I mean, you have to ask. Because they weren't thrown into the fire, they fell into the fire. Did they just be like, instead of a furnace, was it a furnace with a hole in the top? And when you took the lid off the top of the furnace to throw them in? But then how did Nebuchadnezzar look into the fire? How did he look in? There wasn't glass in the front, was there? They didn't have something like that, did they? So how did he look into the fire and not die? But then how did they get into the fire? How did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get into the fire if the guards were killed before they could throw them in? That's a good question. And then the follow-up that I didn't mean to put on here, but we will, is how did Nebuchadnezzar know what Jesus looked like? And this is why I'm doing this series. I have a couple more still yet, and there's going to probably be way more after that. Because it's like I've been saying, you ask questions. God won't get offended by your questions. So even while I'm doing this video, I'm asking questions. What did the furnace look like? How did Nebuchadnezzar see them in the furnace if the guards died trying to get them into the furnace? How did Nebuchadnezzar get close enough to look? I don't know the answer to that. But that's why we ask questions, because God's not going to get offended by our questions, and questions are the way you learn. If you have a question and you never ask it, then how are you going to learn? It's like anything in the world here. We have the perfect example, but it's like in church we learn what we learn, and if we don't quite know something, you don't want to ask somebody because, if they think less of you. You ask questions. Asking questions is a sign of knowledge. And when you ask a question that I've said, you ask a question and it's not right, or if you think, oh, what if this is the case? And God shows you it's not. It doesn't do any wrong. It doesn't offend him. Ask questions and dig deeper than just, they got thrown into a fire. They didn't get thrown into a fire. They fell into a fire. And Nebuchadnezzar knew what Jesus looked like? What? Ask questions.